I appreciate that, Don. It is kind of a risk for those guys not to be here and to leave the missions and evangelism guys in charge. So yeah, we could do all kinds of things today if we wanted. Give an invitation and all that. I may. I've got some slides. I may follow them, and I've already apologized to the guys back there, because this is a great story. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 1. But Brian already read part of the backstory, so I'm going to have to tell you some backstory. Do you want me to move that? I'm good. You guys are, sorry. Feels like I'm back home in Barstow, right? I'm going to have to tell you some of the backstory from 1 Samuel and a little bit out of 1 Chronicles chapter 10, because there's some mirroring going on there. But it was probably 1998 that was the first time that our four boys and Merla and I took our Mitsubishi van from Amman, Jordan, drove down to the Jordan Valley, up north to the Sheikh Hussein crossing. I've got a slide there, Isaac, of that. Yeah, if you want, and you can follow that just quickly, because I have to show you a few pictures there. In fact, missionary, it was all I could do not to just put all of my photos, from this region there. But I love that road and I love that crossing, partly because that's the Gilead area. If you're going to go north of Amman, in fact, when we get to these Jabesh Gilead guys, there's some Amman connection with them as well. I'll get to that, I think, unless I forget it, because I've already mentioned it right now. But anyway, we drove up. Now I'm having deja vu, like I've told this story in chapel before, and you've actually looked at me and said, just moving on, Pate. So thanks, Jim. So you go to this crossing, and across the way, I never go to that cross. So two things happen right there. Let me get back on track. We drive our van over, and at that point, you're putting your van through like a airport security x-ray machine. So I hand the keys to an Israeli officer. We step inside. They take the van inside this building. And then on the other side of the building, the guy gives me my keys and my passport back. And he says, "Have you ever been to Mozambique?" And I said, "No." And he takes my passport and he stamps it and he goes, "You have now." And I look in my passport, and there's some, I don't even understand what it says, but apparently it says, it's some kind of a Mozambique sticker just telling people that, yeah, I've gone through the security thing there. Once you leave this crossing, though, you get to Beit Shan. And I never passed that, and we passed it so many times on the way to Capernaum that my boys would say, "Dad, do we have to go to Capernaum again?" And I'm like, "All right, look, if you go to Capernaum, I'll take you to the alligator farm, which is on the north end of the Sea of Galilee up there." So I never passed this route. And the next slide, guys, is the Beit Shan Park. So every time I pass Beit Shan, the national park there, I'm reminded of what happened at the end of this story of Saul in 1 Samuel 31. When Saul, and so Brian read kind of the end of the story, Saul is killed in battle, and it just mentions that just kind of matter-of-factly there in 1 Samuel 31, and I'm reading out of, I guess this is the Holman Christian Bible, but it's really the grandkid annotated Bible, and I realize my scripture that are up there are going to be New King James. So nevertheless, here in 1 Samuel 31, it says, "So on that day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men." That's how this whole intro ends. And interestingly, Saul knew this day was coming. Saul knew when he went to that battle that was going to be it, which is incredible to think, because just a couple of chapters earlier, he's gone to the witch of Endor. Do you remember that story? And he tries to find Saul or Samuel to tell him what's going on and how things are going. He's distressed, and that's a word that's going to be used in describing David here in 2 Samuel 1. So in his distress and depression and uncertainty, earlier Saul goes to visit this witch, and so Saul knows this day is coming, in that Samuel says through her, and you can debate whether that was Samuel or a demon or whatever it is, but I'm not going to do that this morning. But the word that Saul gets is, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Now that's a pretty ominous word, isn't it? I mean, all of us have been to the doctor, and I know you've gotten calls and I've gotten calls from the doctor. And I remember getting one time when we lived in Brea and then pulling over to the side thinking, okay, so that's how I'm going to die. That kind of thing. Well, this is pretty specific where he's told, tomorrow you're going to be with me, which has made it where some, like Josephus, have kind of argued eloquently that Saul is sort of a martyred hero type guy, and that he knows this is coming and he's just valiantly fighting away. But what happens in the story is Saul and his men and his sons are fighting. The war gets intense, and in that intensity, an archer shoots him, and he's hit. And he realizes he's hit and wounded in a mortal way. He's not going to make it. And so he stops with his armor bearer, and he says to his armor bearer, I don't want these uncircumcised Philistines to kill me. I want you to run me through with your sword. And the armor bearer is afraid to do it, and so he doesn't do it. And so it says that Saul then laid on his sword. In fact, there's a picture from these Dutch masters. And it's interesting if you look at art throughout Europe in this period, a lot of the art has to do with biblical stories and grand stories like this. So there's kind of the zoom in on this medieval-looking Saul with his armor bearer in their knight armor, laying on his sword. But so that's how the story goes, and that's kind of echoed in 1 Chronicles 10 as it is here in 1 Samuel chapter 30, in the end of Saul in that battle. Now, the only thing that's added, and Brian read that in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 8, is the next day then, the Philistines come to strip the bodies, which means that they did not get to him. They didn't find his body, after he had laid on his sword. So the next day, the Philistines come, they find Saul and his sons. They take his armor, they cut his head off, they take his body, and they pin it to the wall of Beth-shan. And then it mentions these brave guys from Jabesh Gilead that decide they're going to go do something about this. And it says that they go all through the night. So there it is in 1 Samuel 31, verse 11 to 13. All the valiant men arose and traveled all night. They took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall. They came to Jabesh, they burned them, and then they buried their bones under a tree. So these guys, just a little side note that's kind of fun in the story, is these Jabesh Gileadites, what's their interest, and why would they be the ones to go all through the night just to take the bodies down? Well, if you look back in the Old Testament, there's a couple of connections that they have with Saul personally, and a couple of reasons why that they would probably be the ones that say, we're not going to let that go. There's a weird story in Judges. In fact, it's one of the weirdest stories in the book of Judges. But it's the story of the Levite and his concubine. Do you remember that story? And when they all make a vow that none of us are going to give our daughters to the people from Gibeah, which is Saul's hometown. We're not going to give our daughters to them because of what they've done to the Levite's concubine. And so they make a vow, basically, we're going to slaughter all the Benjaminites, and we're not going to give any daughters to them, so we're going to extinguish them. The next day, they have remorse, and then they begin to have a huddle, and they're like, was anybody not here when we made that vow? It's a great story. Check it out. So they start talking. Was anybody not present when we said we're not going to do this? And they're like, well, the Jabesh Gilead guys, they didn't come over, which that would have been a pretty good effort for them to come, because remember, they're on the Jordanian side of the river. They would have had to have come over to this meeting, and so they didn't come. And so the children of Israel decide, we're going to send guys up there, and we're going to take the unmarried women from them, and we're going to kill a bunch of them too. So that's a great way to solve their problem, right? But at the end of the day, the people in Gibeah, Saul's hometown, end up being connected through marriage with the people from Jabesh Gilead. And the other thing that happens in Well, I can't find it in my notes. I'm just going to tell you. The other thing that happens is there's a guy in Ammon, the king of the Ammonites, named Nahash. And Nahash comes down to the people in Jabesh Gilead, and they're neighbors, and so he wants to have a peace treaty with them. And the Jabesh Gileadites, it's to their advantage to have a peace treaty. They don't want to have any trouble with the Ammonites. But he says, for this peace treaty to work, you guys are going to have to poke your right eye out. And so they're like, could you give us, they literally say, could you give us a week to think about it, And so they think about it, but as they're thinking about it, guess what? They send a runner to Gibeah, and they said, can you send Saul over here to solve this problem? And so Saul comes over, takes care of Nahash and the Ammonites, and defeats them. And so the Jabesh Gilead people are able then to not have to have their eye poked out. And so they have all of that to say, they have a reason to why they're the ones that are running over these brave men through the night to take the body off, burn the bodies, bury the bones there in Jabesh Gilead. Now, all of that brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 1. That's a long time, right? Long time. And so here we are in 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites. Let's go to my next slide there, okay? The guy holding the cigarette and the tea. You got that, Isaac? Yeah, there we go. Now, I put this up here on purpose. A couple of things so we're in a big transition, right? So we've got the end of Saul's life, and now we're transitioning into what happens next. And we're going to go forward 3 days. So the last chapters of 1 Samuel are really kind of a week of time. And in that week of time, a lot of stuff is happening. Let me just kind of explain what's happening and then why I have the picture. First, the picture is, in the Middle East, what you do when you're resting. If you're going to take a deep breath and you're going to kind of let the dust settle, you grab a cigarette and you grab some tea. Now, not that I did that. I'm just saying I've observed that, right? Of course, I would never do that. Not that I would tell you anyway. But since it's just us and we're all friends, if you come to my house, I do have a cigarette collection from all over the world. It's just one of the things that I do. My dad smoked his whole life. Cigarettes killed my dad. So I kind of just have that for some weird, macabre reason, right? But the point being, in that area of the world, when somebody says to you, Allah yatik alafia, God give you the rest, one of the things you do is you just have a cup of tea and you may have a cigarette, right? In fact, at Ramadan buffet at Pizza Hut, if you want to see how this works, the call to prayer goes off, and instead of grabbing a piece of pizza right off, the guys get a cigarette and they get a cup of tea. So this is David now. So 2 Samuel chapter 1, David has been back in Ziklag for 2 days. Now, isn't that a fun word to say? Ziklag. Ziklag. So let's back up and let's set the scene of why is David in Ziklag for 2 days. So in prior chapters there in 1 Samuel, David has been running from Saul. Remember that? So he's running from Saul and he becomes friends with Achish, one of the kings he's the king of Gath. So he's one of the Philistine kings. And Achish gives David the city of Ziklag. In fact, you can go to the next slide there, Isaac. Yeah, where is David's Ziklag? I like the title of that article in Biblical Archaeological Review. Where is David's Ziklag? Again, I think that's just a fun word to say, isn't it? Ziklag. He's in Ziklag. And so look at the next slide. It's about 100 miles. So what's happening in the week before this happens? David has had an incredibly difficult week. Now in 2 Samuel 1, he's sitting in Ziklag just kind of chilling, okay? Because here's what's happened. In the couple of weeks before, and really the week before, he's gone from Shunem, so he's up there in the north of Israel, and because he's basically Achish's bodyguard. In fact, what happens in those prior chapters is David and his 600 or so men are marching in review before the Philistine kings, about to go to battle with Saul and the Israelites. And as they're parading, doing their review, one of the Philistine kings says to Achish, hey, who are these guys? Why do we have Hebrews? Why are there Israelites marching with us to fight the Israelites? That can't be. And they tell Achish, you got to send these guys back. So Achish, I'm just going to paraphrase it, goes up to David and he says, hey, look, it's not you, it's them, but you can't stay here. You got to go home. So David goes about 100 miles then from the north down to Ziklag, which is a fun word to say. Did I mention that? So he goes down to Ziklag, and when he gets to Ziklag, guess what happens? He and his men discover that all of their families and their children have been taken kidnapped by the Amalekites. In fact, it's so bad, and I'm just way off script here, so I'm just going to keep paraphrasing it, and then I'll take a second and find out where I'm going to go. It's so bad that the scripture says there that the men in that camp cried so much that they couldn't cry anymore. So this is a horrible situation. Okay, there you go, thanks. 1 Samuel 36. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. So there's going to be a mutiny going on here. The soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Now this is a key piece of the whole story. This line and the contrast between what happened when David was distressed and what happened when Saul was distressed. But I'm going to keep moving. So David and his men go hunt down the Amalekites. They seek the Lord and they go after the Amalekites. They find an Egyptian guy in the desert, and they get some vital intel from this guy, and he tells them where the Amalekites are. They go kill all the Amalekites, take all their stuff. It just says that 400 young Amalekite guys got on camels and headed south. So after that, they come back with their families to Ziklag, and that's where we pick it up then in 2 Samuel chapter 1. So on the third day, so now he's been there, so he's back a couple days. On the third day, this guy arrives. So all of these stories are going on at the same time, right? It'd be a great motion picture. So you've got David fighting the Philistines in the north, or Saul and the Philistines in the north, David and the Amalekites in the south. Now there's a short lull where David's able to breathe. He's sitting there in Ziklag. And now here comes a runner, a messenger that approaches the group. And here's what happens. So on the third day, a man with torn clothes and dust on his head came from Saul's camp. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. In intercultural communication, we talk about body language. And so there's a ton being communicated right here, nonverbal communication. This guy is in mourning, obviously. He's got bad news he's bringing with him. His clothes are torn, he's disheveled, and he comes and he falls before David. Something has gone on with this guy. I remember being in a refugee camp on the Sudanese-Ethiopian border. And in the house of one of the NGO guys there, and it was a dark room, and in the corner of the dark room was a guy in military fatigues, and he had a piece of cardboard covered in green over him that kind of acted like a shield, and he just stayed in the corner the whole time like this. And I remember asking the guy at the site there, what's happening here? They said he'd been in the war of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and he just had PTSD, and he had committed that was what he was going to do the rest of his life, never see another person. So a lot of body language communicating a big message here. So this guy comes to David, and he falls down before him, and then David begins to ask him questions. And this story with this guy is an incredible story, and it's going to go about 17 verses, but we'll look through it as quickly as we can. The third day, a man with torn clothes comes. Okay, David asked him, "From where have you come?" He replied, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What was the outcome? Tell me," David asked him. "The troops fled from the battle," he answered. "Many of the troops have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." David asked the young man who brought the report, "How do you know Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" Now the guy changes his story just a tad, which as you read it, so one of the big questions of the guys that are in the study carols as they look at this passage is the Amalekite guy lying? And yes, he's lying, because 1 Samuel and First Chronicles both tell the same story, and this guy has a different story. Now, some have said, well, maybe he was telling it and giving more detail, but no, I don't believe this guy at all. So David says, how do you know they're dead? He says, well, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. Now, first he says, I've come from the camp, right? Now he's just like, well, I just happened to be up there. And as I was up there, I saw Saul leaning on his spear. And at that very moment, the chariots and the cavalry were closing in on him. Now, we already know that they didn't even get to him till the next day when they found him and stripped his body. But he says, they're pressing on him, and so Saul turns to me, verse 7, and he saw me and he called out. And so I answered, I'm at your service. And he said, who are you? And I told him, I'm an Amalekite. Then he begged me, stand over me and kill me, for I'm mortally wounded, but my life still lingers. So I stood over him and I killed him because I knew that after he'd fallen, he couldn't survive. I took the crown that was on his head and the armband that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. So this Amalekite tells David, I killed him, here's your crown, here's the armband. And later on we find out that he's expecting that David's going to give him a reward. And he's very much misjudged David's heart and his character, because David's not going to do that. So he comes to David and says, here's what's happened. I'm the one that ran him through. And so David at that point just lets it sit, and he says that David took his clothes and tore them off, and all the men with him did the same, and they mourned, wept, and fasted until the evening of those who died into the evening for those who died by the sword. For Saul, his son Jonathan, and the Lord's people in the house of Israel. So they're mourning what? For Saul, for Jonathan, and for the people, and for the house of Israel. And now David goes back to the guy and he inquires a little bit further, and he says, so where are you from again? And the guy says, I'm a son of a foreigner. Basically, my dad has a resident visa here, and so he's a foreign worker that's in Israel, and I'm an Amalekite. Now, wouldn't it be ironic if the same people that Saul was supposed to extinguish earlier, and why the kingdom is going to be taken from him, and God's already told him that if he's done in by an Amalekite, would Saul even do that? Absolutely not. Even Saul would not ask an uncircumcised Amalekite to kill him. So the man changes his story. I'm a foreigner, I'm an Amalekite. And David answered, how is it then that you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David summoned one of his servants and said, come here and kill him. And the servant struck him, and he died. For David had said to the Amalekite, your blood is on your own head, because your own mouth testified against you by saying, I killed the Lord's anointed. All right, so we're gonna look at a couple other things then. Why would David kill the Amalekite? So there have been a lot of reasons that are kind of speculated. Why would David kill the Amalekite? Well, one answer is that's just what happens to people that tell bad news. Yeah, and so you just didn't want to do that. You don't want to give bad news to the king. There's other stories of messengers and news in the Old Testament. Again, we won't take the time to look at that. There's another weird reason that some scholars have given, and that is that David is doing a political act here. By killing the Amalekite and not going on social media and tweeting and posting pictures of, here's the armband and here's the crown, and guess what? I'm the anointed now, I'm the king. That David is solidifying his kingdom in the future. And I don't buy that, especially when we get to the last piece of this story. So why would he kill him? Well, maybe it's just what happens to guys that have bad news, or maybe he's doing some kind of political thing, or maybe it's that the Amalekites are David's enemy, and this guy doesn't know that David still has the blood of his kinfolks on his sword from having killed his people just a few days prior. So is that why he's killing him? He's killing this guy because this guy has taken it upon himself to kill the Lord's anointed. And that's a big theme in the story. And you see, I don't think it's the biggest theme. And I'm going to show you what I think the biggest theme is in just a minute. But the reason why David kills him, and David asks him, how is it then that you would raise your hand against the anointed of the Lord? In other words, how are you, an Amalekite, taking it upon yourself to do God's will and to do what God had planned on your own? In fact, David knew this day was coming. I left that slide out, Isaac, if we can throw that back in there. So David knew this was coming, and David had already said, David had two chances to take Saul out. Once in a cave, and once as he and his number one guy went through Saul's camp. Do you remember this? They were tiptoeing through the camp, and there's Saul sleeping. He's got his water jug and his spear. And Abishai tells David, all right, now's the chance. God's given him to you, just take it and run him through. And David's like, I can't do it. In other words, I can't speed up what God is going to do. And this is a key line in the whole thing. Look at that in verse 10. David said, furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go to battle and perish. David is saying, this is how this is going to end. How's this whole thing going to end? David isn't saying to his people, it's going to end when I take him down. He says, God's got this, and it's going to end when God makes it end. So as the Lord lives, so maybe the Lord's going to strike him, or his day is going to come to die, or he's going to die in battle and perish. So at that point, the Amalekite is killed. All right, let me wrap it up and just give you the two big points I think are in the whole thing. So as the story goes on then, the key to this whole thing, well, there's two pieces. One is, I find it incredible how in the fuzziness of life, David always gets centered and focused on the Word of God and on God's promises to him. Now, he's going to waver. We know David's story. He'll waver a time or two, but for the most part, he's constantly centered on God and His Word. And that's a great takeaway from the whole thing. And you see the contrast with Saul and with David the whole way. You see Saul in distress, trying to figure things out on his own. You see David in distress, and he goes to the Lord. I know it's going to surprise some of you, but when I was a student at California Baptist College, before it was a university, Don, my last year, I had two big problems. I had a lot of credits to take, and I had a grade point average that needed to go up for me to get into seminary. And so I know you guys are like, what? You know, if you've had me in class, you're not surprised. And so I took a lot of ceramics classes. And I mean, it was great. Didn't have to study a lot. All you had to do is buy clay. But I learned, the Lord taught me a lot in ceramics. If you have a piece of clay and it's on a spinning wheel, the key to that becoming something is to be totally centered on that wheel. You've got to put your elbows into your gut, and you've got to press on that, and you've got to get that clay right in the middle. And it's incredible to me as you read through the story of David, as we've had this great series in chapel, that throughout David's life, he just stays, and you look at the Psalms, he stays focused and centered just on God and His promise and God's Word. Never really wavers for that. In the fuzziness of life, he never changes. And so you see that as we go now into this last piece where David, the key to this whole thing is David's song. Okay, so David, verse 17, David sang the following lament for Saul and his son Jonathan. And he ordered the Judites to be taught the song of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. We don't have the book of Jasher, do we? But let me just read you what the story says. He says, in the splendor of Israel lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. He's going to say that 3 times in this lament, in his song. He says, don't tell it in Gath. Don't announce it in the marketplaces of Askelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will gloat. It's like, don't tell those guys up there. And again, that's counterintuitive, right? Today, a leader would have just said, make sure you tell them because I'm in charge now, right? It's me. And then verse 21, mountains of Gilboa, let no dew or rain be on you, or fields of offerings. In fact, if you were to have gone to Mount Gilboa before Israel began to plant trees all over, you'd see it's still, and even today, it's still pretty much a rocky top. The Israelis themselves took this curse on Gilboa pretty seriously. Verse 21, And for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul no longer anointed with oil. Jonathan's bow never retreated. Saul's sword never returned unstained. For the blood of the slain and the bodies of the mighty, Saul and Jonathan loved and delightful, were not parted in life or death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxurious things, who decked your garments with gold ornaments. How the mighty have fallen in the thick of battle. Now, again, look at what he's doing in this lament. He's not just trashing Saul and Jonathan. Easily he could have trashed Saul, right? Now we know he's going to be nice to Jonathan, right? But he's telling the good things about these people. And again, that's the temptation sometime for us when the mighty fall, for us to trash them and say, you know, they're kind of getting what they deserve, right? David doesn't do that. He talks about the good things that they've done. And then verse 26, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother, for you were a friend to me. Your love was more wonderful than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. Now that last refrain and those 3 times that David uses that term, to me, that's the key to this whole thing. The topic I was given is David mourns the loss of Saul. But let me tell you what David is mourning. David is mourning the loss of potential. And David is mourning those that God has put His hand on, and we've watched those people fall. And do I have a slide on that, Isaac, that last piece? Not the last verse, but the last piece. Yeah, there is here now a deeper and more visceral sort of angle for this whole thing. He laments his loss and the loss of the people as they look at what's happened. All right, I gotta end this right, guys. I'm sorry. All right. So David is mourning the state of the Lord's anointed and the loss of his best friend, and it's painful and genuine. And if you look at that lament again, and you see how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen. We had a phrase in Arabic that's just like Ya salam, like, oh my goodness. It's just like us saying, dude. And so David is in a place where all of the emotion and all of the stuff that's coming out of him, he's sitting in Ziklag. He gets this report and he's moved from that well of emotion to just look at life and say, my goodness, look at the waste. How the mighty are fallen. How the mighty are fallen. It's the reaction of the man of God when we've watched the mighty fall. And I've got to tell you, over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I have not enjoyed having to scrub my notes of the mighty who've fallen. When students give me feedback and they're like, how could you have this person and quote this person in your notes after what's gone on in their life? I'm tired of watching the mighty fall. My friends who are pastors and who are missionaries who've been put on planes and fired at trustee meetings, and I'm tired of watching pastors do the same things that they preach against, because in the midst of the fuzziness and the toughness of life, instead of being centered on God's Word and God's promises, they decide to take things into their own hands and work things out. How the mighty are fallen. So at the end of the day, how the mighty are fallen. For you, stay centered on the Lord and His Word so that it's not you who falls. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. It says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. How the mighty are fallen. How the mighty are fallen. Take care that you do not find yourself rejoicing and celebrating those getting what you think that they deserve, because the truth is you probably deserve the same thing. Mishake, isn't that so? Yeah. How the mighty are fallen. Oh, that we have the same compassion on the mighty and the weak, even to the point of Paul saying in Romans 9, 2 and 3, I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren. This is the heart of David, a man after God's own heart, modeled to us as we respond to people that have fallen around us.